physical illness and mental illness or mental disorder is the same. And so they're like, yeah, just, power through. You have a headache, you just keep going. But there's some things people with Asperger's just really, really struggle with, so they can't power through it. And this is like a physical representation of the difference. So my brain looks like that. If I suddenly woke up with a brain that looks like that, it would be extremely strange for me. And the same is true if a neurotypical person woke up with an Asperger's brain, it would confuse them so much. So I have trouble processing information that is heard. So if you give me a list of tasks and there's 10 of them on there, I'll remember probably 4 of them. But if you write it down, I can memorize the list and recite it back to you in 10 weeks. I remember a lot of what I read, but not a lot of what I hear. But in some Asperger's cases, they have nonverbal learning disorder, which is almost the exact opposite of that. They cannot learn visually, they can only really learn through things they hear. So again, that's one of the things that's when you've met one person with Asperger's, because sometimes like this, the symptoms are completely opposite of one another. These related disorders are, if you have Asperger's, you are very much more likely to have anxiety, social anxiety, depression, and sometimes they have the symptoms of ADHD and OCD as well. So the reason they have the anxiety and the social anxiety disorder is because we don't understand why people do what they do a lot of the time. Handshakes, I spent an entire year trying to puzzle out why people shook hands. I mean, I knew how to do it and everything, it was just something we did, but I couldn't figure it out. It just didn't seem necessary to me. But put that in a more complicated context, and I couldn't figure out why people said what they said. And it was hard to relate to kids my own age because there's a lot of trends, and not a lot of them make very much sense. So then you start to feel a little bit like, am I doing something wrong? Am I doing this right? And it's just very confusing. And if you can't get it right, which you can't, a lot of times people get depressed. And OCD, they stick to the routines that work for them to help alleviate their anxiety, and so they have the symptoms of OCD. This is kind of a basic overview of Asperger's. A lot of it is, I've said it before, and a lot of it relates back to the picture of the brain. We process what we see a lot better than what we hear. So sarcasm, jokes, and irony, a lot of that would go over someone with Asperger's head. I grew up with a mom who was a speech pathologist, so she's not too happy about it, but she taught me sarcasm and irony. So I understand those just as well as any other person. Occasionally I will miss a joke, not very often, I guess because I was exposed to all of that and all of the speech pathology that anyone with autism would have gotten. But I do have unusual speech patterns sometimes. I'm not a good public speaker because I have to remind myself to make eye contact and try and remind myself to move my voice up and down. Sometimes I can be monotone, or I used very complicated words at a young age. One thing that people with Asperger's do is they might say beckon instead of come or something like that. So, and maybe old-fashioned speech, or do not instead of don't, in sentences that it sounds strange in. Eye contact, there can either be too much or too little. That's another thing that when you've met one person with Asperger's, there are some who stare at people and there we go. There's some who stare and don't know when to look away, and there are others that just don't make eye contact at all. They do everything they can to avoid it. And so their facial expressions kind of go along with the inborn social skills. People are born usually with, you smile when you're happy, you frown when you're sad. Sometimes people with Asperger's, they will be able to show anger and aggression, but they could be happy and just have a completely blank face. So if they're trying to appear as if they do not have Asperger's, they might, try and smile and it'll come out looking a little bit like they're in pain. Just if you need a frame of reference, look at all of my school pictures. And so those are just a few of those. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier, Asperger's in females, the average age for a male to be diagnosed is from 2 to 6. But it's not uncommon for women to go into their late 40s and then be diagnosed with Asperger's after they've recognized it in themselves. I know I only got diagnosed after I read something about it, and I told them I want to go in for testing, and this sounds like exactly like me. So I probably wouldn't have been diagnosed if I had not insisted that I had gone in. And the reason for that is females have what's called masking behaviors. Intellectual imitation is another word for it. I see someone, I act like that person, and I do it in a way that I use my brain, and so I can appear to be at least limited. I'll have limited success in social situations. It's like adopting a persona. It's not what you want to be saying, it's not what you want to be doing, but it's what you're doing to fit in with some people. But there's another group of children, girls with Asperger's, who will be on the right side of this, which is instead of adopting the persona and trying to interact with people that way, they'll avoid other children, they'll play alone. They love animals. They like animals better than people because, animals don't want to stare at them. And they'll read all the time. I was kind of a mixture of both of these. I would interact with people, but at the same time I was fine playing by myself from a very young age. My mom would find me at 3 in the morning at 3 years old, just kind of sitting, playing alone. I was fine with it. I didn't see any problem with it. I love cats. We've had 3 cats, and they both, so I always interacted with animals very well. And maybe Settinger remembers this, but I read a lot. So I was kind of a mixture between the two, but sometimes it's one, sometimes it's other, sometimes it's a mixture of both. These are some general ones that might, in females that might relate to one or the other, but they're not specific to one of the 2 types. When younger, like preschool age to young elementary school, people with Asperger's, the females don't want affection when they're upset. Like, when a child's crying, you go over there, hug them, like, hey, we'll give you this toy because that one broke, and then they stop crying. Asperger's, that doesn't work with them. It just, they don't want a hug. They want the toy to be not broken. And they can't really be distracted from that. And this kind of goes along with the solitary play. They would organize toys, like they might have Barbie dolls, like the other girls on the block, but they would organize them in like patterns rather than, play with them creatively, or they might reenact scenes from school that happened to try and understand people's motivations behind them. I didn't really do either of those things. I did have Barbie dolls. I don't know where they went. I kind of grew out of them after a while, but I never did either of those 2 things. the non-gender